everyone. We're so excited about our All Books Considered event tonight, and I'm going to be talking with Jim Nichols about his novel, Blue Summer. A big thank you to our two sponsors and our book partners who helped many of you secure your copy of Blue Summer. And to those of you who sent questions in advance, thank you for that. If you haven't sent in a question yet but have one, use the comments feature on either Facebook or YouTube, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. So we're going to get started now. Welcome to Jim Nichols. And thank you so much for taking an hour with us this evening to talk about your novel, Blue Summer. And Jim, I want to start by asking you about the structure of the novel. You know, right away, right off the bat, we find out the big thing that happens, right? The very beginning, we find out that there's headlines. You've probably read the headlines. And then by the time, I don't know about you all who are also in the book club tonight, but by the time I got to the end, when this thing actually happened, I was going back to the first chapter because I had gotten so involved in other parts of his story that I had forgotten he killed someone.
Yeah.
So tell me about how you decided to structure the novel that way.
Well, I wanted a prologue of some sort because I wanted to introduce Cal Shaw, who's the main character and the narrator of the story. And I thought it was a good dramatic way to do it by showing him in where he was currently as he told the story. And in fact, happened to be that he was in jail. So he's introducing himself in this prologue, and he has to talk about being in jail and how he got there. And I use that to sort of introduce the character and his voice as a launching spot to go on, and also to introduce the idea of the melody that runs through the novel and is a big part of the whole story.
All right. And what about the decision to sort of jump around in years?
Well, once I had that prologue in place, that sort of defined the book, and it made it mandatory that I jump back and forth because Cal is telling the story. Well, he's in the present time as the book opens, but he's telling two different time stretches. One when he was a child, and one when he was an adult, about to head back to his childhood home. So we had to go back and forth between those two time periods and lead into it with a third time period. It made it a little complicated.
So I have to ask you, because there are such vivid descriptions of trumpet playing. Are you a trumpet player?
Unfortunately, I'm not a trumpet player. I have a trumpet. My dad was a trumpet player. Okay. And I have his beautiful trumpet, and I can toot on it a little bit, enough to know what it feels like, but not enough to be a trumpet player.
All right, and now a little tiny question. Calvin and Alvin, how'd you come up with that?
I don't know. I was talking about Calvin. Calvin was talking about his childhood, and he was mentioning the members of his family, and Calvin and Alvin, sorry, it wasn't my idea. That just sort of jumped into the dialogue. I think Calvin threw it in there. I just kind of typed it.
I love how Cal addresses the reader. I love how he's the self, I don't know what if there's a name for the literary device of him, talking about writing the novel. Did you, again, was that a conscious decision, or did it just kind of happen?
Whoops. Where am I?
We can hear you.
Sorry. I had to plug the power cord in. I just got a
there you are.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I forgot the question. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm on the last page now, but you do this throughout the novel. Anyway, that's my story as well as I can tell it.
Yeah.
He is acknowledging that he's writing a novel to tell you his story.
Well, to him, it's not a novel. He's in prison and he's writing this down. He says in the prologue, I thought I would try to write this down. And so he's
Yeah.
sort of naturally addressing whatever reader might happen to find this manuscript, but he's kind of doing it, I think, more for therapy. And as he says later in the book, it started out as letters to the two folks that he met on the bus. And he went from there to trying to write the whole thing down.
Well, I wouldn't do this usually, but I have to mention, Jim, that on today's Maine Calling was a book called Second Chances, and the author teaches a writing class at the Maine State Prison. And one of the things that's which is in Warren, where you used to live, but also one of the things he's so blown away by is what natural writers, the men that he works with are. And then now here your novel is somebody writing this from a correctional facility. What I thought, go ahead.
Just a comment about that. After my first book of stories came out, I got a call from the parole office in Augusta, and they asked me if I would come and meet with the parolees who had voted my book, Slow Monkeys and Other Stories, as their favorite book. So I went up and visited with them twice, and between me and the parolees, we decided to call it the Book Club for Bad Guys, and went up there a couple of times and talked to them and had a really a great time. Some very interesting people and some very nice minds in that group.
Yeah,
kind of what we were talking.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of questions coming in, Jim, but I thought that we would have you read a passage from the novel before we take some of the questions from our readers.
Okay, I think I should read that prologue that we started talking
about.
Yeah. They'll all understand the mystery of what we were talking about. Prologue. Bolduc Correctional Facility, 1997. So I thought I'd try to write this down. Chances are I'm no literary savant, but I promise my heart's in the right place. And I have been a world-class bookworm for my whole pathetic life. So maybe that'll help. Who knows? I guess we'll see. I think it's worth telling at any rate. I don't see anyone else volunteering to do it. And Lord knows I've got plenty of time now to try and figure it out, thanks to the great state of Maine. My name is Calvin Shaw. No household name, to be sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it still rang a bell with some of you out there. There were some pretty lurid headlines at the time, after all. Musician kills stepfather with trumpet, that sort of thing. I can hear you now. You're that guy. Yeah, I'm that guy. But you might also have heard of me if you're into what they call cool jazz. I'll bet you're at least familiar with some of my music. Blue Summer, for instance. Everybody knows Blue Summer because Tony Bennett had a hit with it after a lyricist named Billy Weber added words to my music, and any number of artists have covered it since. It was a long blue summer, a wrong blue summer, and so on. I'd sing it if I could sing. But anyway, you remember. And maybe Weber's words weren't exactly what I had in mind, but I'm not complaining. I'm lucky the thing exists at all. Never mind becoming a near standard, if I do say so myself, because there were some pretty long odds against that happening. Reason being that it chose such a dismal time in my life to come dancing along. See, I'd about decided to bring the old curtain down. I'm not sure exactly why it had come back. I mean, I'd been a recent guest of the Pinellas County Jail, which wasn't what you'd call a real morale booster. And I was also drying out, which can do funny things to your head. But I'd been way low down before without thinking it might be time to jump off a bridge. It doesn't matter anyway. It's just that that's where things stood when this stubborn little melody showed up. And that's a big part of my story, that I was at a low point, maybe a bottom, And then Blue Summer came along and started to turn things around.
Jim, do you have a tune in your head when you think of what Blue Summer sounds like? Do you hum something to yourself?
I do, I do, and I have melodies for some of the other um, tunes that Cal wrote that show up as section headings in this book. One called Burgundy City. I've gotten quite a long way with that one.
Are you going to share?
No, I don't think I could do the tune in my head justice by, whistling it.
Okay. And I have to ask you that, as you read, it's so funny to hear you read the passage compared to myself reading it on the page. And it made me think, did I have to have somebody kill someone with a trumpet as the murder weapon? Did that come first? Or did I want to explore this character with this past, and then this is where he ends up?
Yeah, the trumpet as a weapon thing came toward the end when I figured out.
Really? Really? Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. That's
before I wrote the prologue. Also.
Wow. So you wrote it and then you went back and wrote it, the prologue. You wrote the rest of the novel. Fantastic. So I'll start with questions. This one's from Paul, who lives in Warren. And he says, is there any part of Blue Summer that was inspired by your time living in Warren, Maine? People, places, atmosphere.
I can't say there was, but an earlier book called Hull Creek had a lot to do with Warren.
Is Baxter completely imaginary?
It is. It's sort of an amalgam of different towns that I've lived in or lived near. For example, there's a sort of a desert of Maine near Baxter, and there isn't near. And there are other parts of Baxter that are like Thomaston. So, yeah, it's a combination. It's easier that way.
We have a question here from Kathy. What a swell story. Jim's characters were so vivid and strong. I loved hanging around with Calvin and Julie and Becky and was grateful for Gus's presence in their lives. I first fell for Cal in one of the opening scenes when he does the invisible ball trick with the kids across the way. Cal had a soft spot for kids in other places in the book. I wonder if that's something Jim shares with his character.
Yeah. I like kids a lot, and I used to do that invisible ball trick with my kids. So, Cal's. I think I'm like Cal in that respect.
I have several questions. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Finish.
Especially little girls, I think, are just beautiful.
I have several questions here from Doris. I'll ask you a couple of them. What was your inspiration for Becky Odell? And how did it occur to you to give her a lurching walk that she learned from her brother who had cerebral palsy?
Becky is similar to a person that I knew who actually grew up with that sort of walk when there was really nothing mechanically wrong with her, but because she had imitated her older brother growing up, just like Becky Odell did, kind of drawn from life, exaggerated a bit. Becky sort of arrived in the book with that walk, and I went with it.
Do you keep journals or notebooks with ideas from people you know, or do things just sort of appear as you're writing?
Both. I do jot things down, and I have tons of notebooks and flip books and just loose sheets of paper thrown in drawers, things like that.
Doris also asks, What were those shapes and colors that invaded Cal's mind?
Well, thanks, Doris. Cal is a bit of a synesthete. He 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 talks about his music that way quite a bit. Where he's in one example, he's following a jazz riff that to him is like a pipe cleaner twisting its way through the chords that the piano player is playing, and he also sees emotions and um, it, you know, I think people know what a what synesthesia is now, but back then it wasn't really very well known, I don't think. But it's sort of a cross where your senses intermingle, and people can taste colors, and they see numbers as colors, and they see emotions as shapes. So I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but Cal has had a head injury, fell out of a tree when he was small, and he has some of that synesthesia because of
Jonathan, who identifies himself as a former Grover's Crossing denizen, writes, the confluence of jazz and literature informs many wonderful works. I have seen it most often in poetry, but Mr. Nichols brings it elegantly and subtly to Blue Summer in a most pleasing and well-crafted way. Particularly, I like his one-sentence paragraphs that are gracefully connected clauses linked by commas and conjunctions. I hear the whispers of Bill Evans and Miles Davis. Who Mr. Nichols is listening to these days for pleasure and inspiration?
it. Well, for jazz, I'm always listening to people like Chet Baker and um, Miles Davis, Freddie Hubbard, Art Pepper. There's an album, the soundtrack of the play Sideman is something I listen to quite often. Clifford Brown is probably my favorite trumpet player. Um, but I listen to singers like Blossom Dearie and Dinah Washington. I recently discovered a blues singer and guitarist named Barbara Lynn. It's amazing, and I'd never heard of her for some reason. Uh, and with that, Nancy Griffith, I like her singing a lot. I guess that gives you an idea of what I listen to.
Brenda
All
Mercer has
those,
a question. I think this question is for me and the others involved in the book club, but we'll turn it into a question for you, Jim. She writes, there seems to be a recurring theme of loss and death in our book list. Was this by design? And I can tell you that I understand where the question came from, especially because we began with Meredith Hall's Beneficence. It was not by design. We really are looking to really highlight some of the astonishing Maine authors in the people we've had so far: Meredith Hall, Lily King, and you, Jim Nichols, some really fine writers who are based in or have connections to Maine. But Jim, to say you could probably pick 7, 10, 25 novels off the bookshelf at your local library, and there would be a recurring theme of loss and death, wouldn't there?
yeah, it's it causes a lot of conflict, and of course, you can't really write a good book without conflict. So it's sort of natural to go there, I think.
Oops. I apologize if you all are hearing my computer ding. I was trying to figure out how to turn that off, and I can't. So, but I will hear Amy from Surrey asks, did Jim do any research about prison life? Has he ever heard from anyone who ever served time about the novel? And if yes, what did they say?
I have not, other than, well, the people that I was talking about, the parolees that I met with in Augusta, that was a different book, but they liked that book because a lot of the characters in it were destined to be parolees themselves, they thought. And I myself have spent um, a few nights in jails in different places. Uh, one was in Tampa, like sort of like Cal at Pinellas County Jail, but not prison.
Okay, so now I'm curious. Were you a cab driver in Tampa?
No, but I was a cab driver in Portland.
Okay, okay. And are we going to tell more of the story of jail in Tampa?
Well, a friend and I went to Tampa between semesters and just on a lark, and we ran out of money faster than we'd thought and hadn't found jobs yet. Um, so I decided I would go steal some food, and I got caught and ended up spending an overnight in Pinellas County Jail with 8 other fellows who had been arrested the same night, who took pity on me as being the only paleface in the group. And actually, when I could have gotten in quite a lot of trouble, I think, it was so nice to me that it has stuck with me ever since. Um, in fact, I wrote about it in Closer All the Time. One of the chapters in Closer All the Time pretty much tells that story of spending that overnight in jail and how nerve-wracking it was.
I was thinking it sounded familiar. So as nerve-wracking as it was then, it was a good background for your later career as a novelist.
Yeah, good material.
Good material, that's right.
Good material.
Fergus in South Portland says, what is Jim's writing process? How long did this novel take? What does he do if he goes through any dry periods?
Um, hmm. It took several years to write. Um, I tend to go through a lazy spell after I do finish something, at least a book length something. And then eventually the well refills and I start getting itchy to write something. And I always have something to write because um, I've started so many things that I always have something to go back to. Right now I'm waiting for my lazy spell to end so I can get back to a first draft um, of a new novel. The writing process itself is I do it pretty much all on the computer, except for note taking and paragraphs and scenes. I'll sometimes write longhand. I feel more connected to them if it's something that I really need to work out. It seems to work better, with a black wing pencil and a sheet of paper. And then I can go back to the computer because I'm a really fast typist. So that facilitates things a little bit.
I read once that John Irving maps out his novels ahead of time. When I told that to Rick Russo, he laughed. He said he never knows how his novels are going to end when he starts them. What about you? Are you somewhere in between or more like one or the other?
I'm more like Mr. Russo, I think, in that I never know where it's going. I end up assembling a cast of characters and just sort of following them around. And the funny thing is, those characters will sometimes bring other characters into the story that I wasn't expecting to see. And on occasion, I've tried to get rid of them because they complicated the story. But they keep coming back, and eventually you just sort of have to throw up your hands and accept it.
So were there any of those in Blue Summer? And if so, who were they? Who did you want to get rid of but kept coming back?
Becky Odell was like that, although I never wanted to get rid of her. But she kind of popped into the book. And the lady and her son on the bus, they just showed up out of thin air pretty much when he got on the bus to head back to Maine. Um, Uh, the other cab drivers, some of them, I mean, they just appeared, but that's sort of a natural sequence of events because he was driving a cab and he would be interacting with some of them. But I think another person who introduced herself was the girl in high school named Donna that called herself Dharma, and she was a fully formed character when she showed up. It's strange, but it's good.
And how much of the novel, when you are presenting this to your editor, to Genevieve, how much is it pretty much intact, or is it really twice as long when when it first goes to your editor?
No, it was about this. It was a little bit shorter, and
Oh,
we lengthened
really?
it a little bit. Yeah. Um, Genevieve wanted a little more fleshing out in certain places. So, and I always listen to what Genevieve says. She's a wonderful editor and a great writer. Um, so it ended up probably being 4,000 or 5,000 words longer than when I submitted it.
Peter in Paris asks, what do you hope people will feel about Cal at the end of the novel? What do you want them to think? Is there anything you had, well, and then is there anything you'd planned on including and didn't? So 3 good questions. Let's start with the first one. What do you hope people will feel about Cal at the end of the novel?
Um, I think that I would like them to see Cal as someone that they could believe is real, and uh, someone who, despite his flaws, had a certain uh, inner strength and a certain stubborn sort of refusal to give up that really helped him. It's a story of redemption, I think, and I think that Cal's inner qualities helped him find that redemption and helped him face up to going back to his childhood home, which took a lot of courage.
Is there anything that you planned on including and didn't? We talked about what you maybe didn't plan on including and did. What about the other way around?
I can't think of anything. There might have been something, but I was kind of following Cal around trying to find out what the story was. I didn't really, I didn't have it planned out so that I had to remove things that I'd planned. It wasn't that well planned, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'll ask you one more question, then I'll see if you can read another passage for us. Susan in Portland asks, what books or writers have inspired you? Is there a specific literary character that you really connected with?
The first book that really inspired me was a book by Hemingway called In Our Time. And it's really that's when I started thinking about writing literary fiction. Before that, I'd sort of had vague thoughts of writing a science fiction book or, um, maybe a mystery or something because I liked writing and I loved reading. I was always reading, had thoughts of trying it myself. Um, One night, working at a little airport in Owl's Head, I didn't have anything to read while I waited for the last flight to come in from Boston. So I had about 3 hours to kill. And I picked up this book of short stories called In Our Time that the passenger had left behind. And I was so taken with the fact that literary fiction, because I hadn't read much of it at all, I was so taken with the fact that it could be so evocative um, and so engaging without being stylish. I mean, it had its own style, but you know what I mean, or ornamental on the surface. And I just felt, well, if that can be literary fiction, maybe I'll give that a try. Um, so I started writing imitation Hemingway stories pretty much the next day. uh, Fortunately, got out of that mode and found more of my own voice. But that was a real inspiration. Other people that have inspired me are Tobias Wolff, um, Monica Wood and Elizabeth Strout in Maine, reading their work. Uh, I liked Erwin Shaw's short stories a lot when I was writing short stories. And Norman Mailer inspired me a lot by um, helping me get a story published and by being a correspondent, encouraging sort of correspondent with me over the course of quite a few years.
So I said I was going to have you read a passage next, but I seem to remember there's a really good Norman Mailer story. Am I confusing things, or is this the good story from your time at the airport?
No, I think we talked about it
On Maine Calling. Yeah, a couple of years
Maine
ago.
Calling.
Yeah, would you mind repeating that for those in the audience who didn't hear that program?
No, not at all. When I was first trying to write short stories, I noticed that Norman Mailer was coming. I was working at the little airport in Alstead for Bar Harbor Airlines. I noticed he was on the flight manifest coming up from Boston, stopping in Rockland briefly, and then going on to Bar Harbor where he had a summer home. And um, for some reason, I found the courage to go on board the plane while I was sitting on the ramp in Owlshead and walk down the aisle to where Mailer was waiting to take off for Bar Harbor with a short story manuscript in hand, a little magazine that I published a story in. Mailer saw me coming and sort of rolled his eyes and said later, you know, a good outcome from an encounter like this is not to be expected, or something like that. But anyway, I told him I didn't want anything from him. I just wanted him to read. I wanted to know that Norman Mailer had read a story of mine and that he could put it in the seat pocket when he was done reading it, because it was only he could read it in the 10 minutes it would take to fly to Bar Harbor, and I would retrieve it when it came back. And he said, "Oh, well, that's a new one, but okay." And he took the magazine, and when the plane came back, the little magazine I gave him was not in the seat pocket. Um, so I figured he'd either thrown it away or had liked it. And when he flew back a couple of weeks later, I made sure I was the one on the ramp to wave in the airplane. And I waited there to see what would happen. And Mailer popped his head out the air share door and he said, "Jim." I said, "Yes, sir." He walked down the air share door, and came over to me and shook hands and said he had liked the story and asked if I had anything more ambitious, a little more ambitious, because this was just a sort of a vignette about kids who are ice fishing. Um, when he asked if I had anything more ambitious, I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out the manuscript. And Mailer shook his head, but he took it and sort of lumbered back on the plane and flew back to the Cape, wrote me a letter saying he had liked that story and enclosed a note that I should send with it to Esquire and tell them to publish it, which I did. And they did, although it took a couple of years to actually publish it. And Mailer wrote a little introductory paragraph that appeared in the magazine with the story.
Did the introductory paragraph tell the story?
It told the story of how we met on the airport. And he said, "I don't know why, but I like meeting talented young writers at airports." And we corresponded right up until he died, almost after that.
Well, a great lesson to those of us who need some courage sometimes, to have a little gumption. That in this case, gumption really made a big difference.
I think it did. Yeah. I mean, it's good on your resume to have a good publication in a national magazine. It helps you be taken more seriously, I think.
Are you ready for another passage?
Sure. This is farther along in the book, and it's Cal at a gig. This is Tampa, 1995. Tampa Red is in good form, but he has a new drummer who manages to consistently come down exactly in the middle of a beat. You or I couldn't manage it if we tried, but he does it naturally, and nothing anyone else plays seems to make any difference. That's bad because it can make it hard to really swing, which is the main idea, right? But I'm able to work with it, which is encouraging. I haven't played in public for some time and haven't played straight in public for years. I could never neglect my horn for long. Even fall down drunk, I was likely to haul it out and start blowing. But performing for an audience with other musicians is a whole different ball of wax. But I'm doing all right. The ideas are there, and once I get warmed up, I find I'm still capable of chasing them into a decent shape. Not setting the world on fire, maybe, but no liability either. And it gets better as we go along. When we're soloing and it drops to me, I know where to go and how to do it. I know how to pick up Red's lines, throw them back at him, how to build off his digression and make it into my own, how to bring it all back to where we started. It feels really, really good. And even better when our audience applauds and whistles and Red looks at me and nods. There's a good crowd and it's smoky and dark in the little joint. My old amigo Rocky Kincaid is there. He looked me up after he got out of the pokey and then figured Tampa was as good a place as any to hang his hat. Kincaid is sitting at one of the old two-tops near the windows with a tall, lovely gal, no surprise with Kincaid, who hasn't been shy about clapping and even whistling when she likes something we've done. When we take a break, I step down from the little foot-high stage and go over to say hello. Rocky kicks a chair out so I can sit down. I take the blazer off and drape it over the back of the chair. This is Celeste Boucher, Rocky says. He's grinning and his forehead is shiny. She's a trumpet girl. She's got a big crush on you. She says you look like Quaid, man. Quaid with a trumpet. Now, how am I supposed to compete with that? I'm sure you're worried about it. Celeste shakes my hand and smiles. I was telling her about our tats, man. Rocky rolls up the sleeve of his pink dress shirt, exposing the tattoo he got in jail, a little blue sash with a flurry of 16th notes flying out of its bell. She's never seen that? Oh, hell yeah, she's seen mine. He pokes at my sleeve, and I roll it up past my own tattoo, which is like Rocky rolling with a trumpet. Celeste reaches over and touches the tattoo on my inner forearm. It gives me a tingle, and she smiles as if she knew it would. Tell her the story, Rocky says. You tell it better than me. She doesn't want to hear all that. It's a good story. Good and boring. I smile at Celeste. Nah, man, it's a tragic tale of something. Of nothing. No, it's definitely of something. Me and you, brother. Two jazz men locked up in the can. Remember when we played for the warden? He winks at Celeste. We never played for the warden. We did when I tell it. Remember how he offered to commute us? Wardens can't commute sentences. Celeste don't know that. She's from the swamp country. Oh, Rocky. Celeste smiles tolerantly. All right, Rocky says she probably knows, so forget that. What did the warden do? He let us bunk together, and instead of peeling potatoes, we got to wail for the population. Which was true. The warden liked jazz and offered to let us skip work detail and practice if we performed for the inmates. So we did. And a guy who played piano joined us, and then we got a drummer, who was better than Tampa Red's drummer, by the way. And just like that, we had a combo. We weren't that bad. Kincaid could play, and the keyboard dude had some chops, and I'd been out of the kick tank long enough to stop shaking. One day, the four of us decided to get the tattoos from the con who had a little business going. Thinking about it, I wonder what happened to the other two guys. Rocky's still inventing jail time adventures for Celeste, making us both laugh when I hear piano chords from the little staging area. I look over and Red is sitting at the piano, looking back with his eyebrows up. I roll my sleeve back down. Time to go to work. Break a leg, Rocky says, and Celeste says, nice to meet you. And when I get back to the stand, I see she's watching with her hands clasped under her chin. It's been a good crowd all night. Most of the other people have been paying attention to, and Henderson himself, standing behind the bar in his green apron, has had a smile on his face most of the night. I pick up my horn, and just like that, Red launches into the intro to Joy Spring, and I have 10 seconds to get myself ready to go. I give him a look, but I'm there, and he laughs. And then we're at the break, and I do my best brownie imitation. The whole set is fast. Red likes to work that way. And we play Dahoud and a couple more quick ones, and then we're cooking along in the middle of a felonious number called well, you needn't. Playing it fast, like on Cheddar's back. Red is comping sweet two-handed chords while I chase after a flexy shape that snakes through the chords, nasty and abrupt, like a used pipe cleaner. I've maintained my fluency as the night's gone on, and now something clicks and I nip up as close as I ever get to master territory, nailing a phrase so precisely when it really shouldn't have fit, that I hear Celeste Boucher laugh out loud, then somebody else whistles. That's a good feeling, maybe the best. I'll stop there. It's probably a little too long.
Jim, how did you channel a performer?
I've been a performer.
Okay.
I've played. For a while, I thought I was going to be the next John Prine, and I played around Portland and Free Street Pub and places like that. And I wrote
Hey,
songs.
That's not on your book. You've been according to this, a bartender, a pilot, a taxi driver, fence builder, orange picker, travel agent, and dispatcher, but nothing about a singer-songwriter.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to take that up with somebody, I guess. But I won't say how good the songs were, but I did get written up in the newspaper once, and I had fun doing it, but it was a struggle. I decided I liked creating without performing better.
Callie in Freeport asks, how far flung has he heard from fans who have read Blue Summer or any of his other works?
Well, a lady who runs a bookstore in Santa Fe told me she really liked it and wanted to stock it. That's about the farthest. Well, there's a fellow in Italy who's trying to. He's a freelance translator, and he's working with, some Italian publishers to try and bring out a translation of Blue Summer. I guess that's the farthest.
Terry asks, is there any future for any of your characters in future short stories or novels? I'm curious on how things pan out for a few of the characters.
Well, the novel that I mentioned before that I'm waiting to get back to is set in Portland, and it's about a cab driver and his friends, and I think Cal is probably going to make an appearance as one of the other cab drivers. This if this was sort of summarized in Blue Summer when he ended up in Portland driving a cab and then went on to New York before ending up in Tampa. So I didn't go into great detail there. Maybe I can tell some more of his story in the new one.
So what year is the new novel set?
It's set about the time that Cal was in Portland, which would be in the 70s.
Okay. Henry in Castine asks, Cal seemed to live as far away from his family as he could. Would his situation be different if he had? I wonder. I think it means if he'd lived closer.
I think he was circling his way back to Baxter via Portland, New York, and Tampa, and maybe he was destined to end up there. I don't think it would have been the same story at all if he had stayed near Baxter, and interacted with his, especially his I can't say the word, but his blank stepfather. So
Wretched.
It would have been his wretched stepfather. Thank you. I think that it would have been a totally different story, maybe with not the redemption that he found the way he did it.
Jonathan, my colleague on the Maine Calling team, says, so which is your favorite Mailer book?
Oh, my favorite Mailer book. The Naked and the Dead. I think. I think he was more organic in that one. Uh, oh, what was his what was his nonfiction novel? I can't remember the title. All I can think of is Truman Capote's book, but Mailer's was preceded that. Um, anyway, I really like that one too. And
Amy Marie
Army.
asks, yeah, Amy Marie asks, can Jim speak to Cal's relationship with his parents, Alvin, Julie, and the barn scene? She's not more specific than that about the relationship. Maybe how you came up with that?
Hmm. Well, the barn was pretty important all through the book, um, which I guess is why it ended up on the cover. But the barn was a refuge for Julie and Cal, uh, and allowed them to get away from Pike, and and find a breathing space away from him. That's the reason that Julie sort of fled there, and unfortunately, what followed was as a result. But when Cal's father was still alive, there's a scene where he goes into the barn for the croquet set, and they're all a happy family by the barn, and then later the barn becomes sort of a refuge, as I said, from the wretched stepfather. And um, Cal dreams about the barn when he's in Tampa, about running out to the barn, and his sister Julie would be alive, and they're waiting for him in the barn. It's a haven, a refuge. It's a symbol of all that in the book.
Deb asks,
Okay.
she writes, the aura of violence and control in Cal's stepfather is chilling. Does Jim have any personal experience with domestic violence?
No, not directly in my family. I haven't, thankfully. But I've known other people that have experienced.
Eliana from Bangor asks, what is the most surprising thing he discovered writing this book?
There were two surprises. Uh, I don't know if this is exactly what she's asking, but the two big surprises for me in the book is that Becky Odell um, got over her she healed from her bad hip, which wasn't really a bad hip, but she got over that. And the other surprise was that Cal hit his stepfather with the trumpet. That was a big surprise.
And that Cal doesn't remember it.
Yeah, he's blocked it.
Let's see here. You kind of answered this before, but we'll try it again. This is from Nick and a Rustic. Are you a typewriter, computer, or script type of writer? Where do you do your best writing? So we know that you said before you usually write on the computer, but you work things out in longhand. But where do you do your best writing? Do you sit at the same desk? Do you go find a coffee shop somewhere?
A lot of times I'm just sitting in my bed with a laptop, and uh, then if I have to write with a pencil, I need to do that on a desk. So I'll come to my desk, and I need a flat surface. And there's something about the posture that helps me work out difficult passages, as we were talking about earlier. But I can write pretty much anywhere, you know, in a chair with one leg up, or in my bed with a couple of pillows behind me. I, the laptop makes it easy, I think.
Yeah. I want to, there's a few places I've dog-eared a little bit in the book, and I just wanted to ask you about those if I could, Jim. One is the line, gosh, we're on page 66 here, and he's thinking about what happened, and he writes, "It was as if my father's accident opened a malevolent door to all the other bad stuff. I think if he'd only stayed alive, none of it would have happened." And that really struck me. I think many people in their lives have a moment where there was a before and an after, and they feel as though that moment changed everything, and
Yeah.
the things that happen next wouldn't have happened, even if they're really unrelated.
Well, I think that was a real hinge in Cal's life, a real pivot. Um, I think at the beginning of the third chapter, maybe, he talks about, we were just an ordinary small town family. And he goes on to describe what the family was like. And then he remembers, bickering with his brother about who knew the most about dinosaurs. Just ordinary, ordinary things that families do and are happy doing. Then when his father died, there's another passage where he says his father was uh, the center of gravity for the family, and when he died, everyone started floating away. That center of gravity was gone, and his mother just wasn't up to the task of uh, pulling everyone back in, and you know, and then the wretched stepfather showed up, and things went from bad to worse. So if his father hadn't died, there would have been no stepfather. That's a big thing, and
And
his
this
sister would
is,
have lived.
yeah, and his sister would have lived. And another passage that struck me, Jim, was this is when the boy on the bus, he's it's the end of the chapter when he's run into the mom and the boy who's got his trumpet. And then the boy withdraws and he says, "I get it completely. For a few minutes, he was able to forget himself, but now the cornet's put away and Loretta's back and he has to remember who he is again. That's the way it goes when you feel separate from everybody else. I don't think it matters why. It's just you can never forget for long because there's always someone or something around to remind you." And I've thought about that a lot, that, when you feel separate from everybody else, even though it's a boy and it's a man, that he got it. He connected with that.
Yeah, Cal talks at another point in the book about how he can forget. Um, there are times when he forgets how miserable his life or all the bad things that have happened to him. He gets involved in something, music or something else, and for a while he can forget. And then there's always someone ready to, remind him somehow and pull him back from that breathing space. And when he meets this kid on the bus who is maybe autistic, or they have a link because they're both into music, but they get they connect, and that connection brings this kid out of um, his own bad place, and he forgets, and that reminds Cal of times when he's been able to forget what happened to him. And but then he goes on to say there's always someone willing to remind you, and that's what makes it so hard. It's hard to forget and hard to move on. It's so many links and connections that you can't get rid of completely.
Julie from Fort Kent asks, How much did this book change from the first draft to the final version? Describe that process.
Oh boy. Um, it changed. Well, it started as a short story. It was actually, it grew out of a story in my book, Closer All the Time, which was about a kid who felt responsible for a girl's death um, because he hadn't been courageous and saved her. And from that, it changed. In the short story, the girl had drowned. I don't remember how it got to be different in Blue Summer, but that was the genesis of it. I wanted to find out what happened to that boy and uh, how he handled the guilt of failing to save the girl who drowned. Then at some point, I think when Cal was in the trailer in Tampa and the melody came into his head, that came that changed everything because he picked up this cornet and to play the melody, and that's when I knew he was a musician. Um, I already knew that his father was a musician and his uncle Gus too, so there was music in the story already. But that when I found out that he was a musician, that pretty much changed everything and changed the course of the story. Then then Becky Odell showed up and she changed it again, especially when she came back in the end of the book. So it's just a very um, it was a very sort of twisted path to get to the ultimate final version. I don't know that I could really parse it any more than that.
It's interesting to me that you said you started it as a short story, and you're claiming you're in your lazy period now. When you go back, will you know when you sit down whether what you're working on next is a short story or a novel when you sit down to write?
No, I know it's a novel already because I've already written the first draft.
Oh, well, there we go.
Yeah, so
So the
I don't
hard
have to
part's
worry
over,
about it.
right?
Hopefully, it won't turn into a short story.
Oh my goodness. And I want to know how you define a lazy period. Does this mean no writing at all, or writing, sitting in front of the computer 30 minutes a day instead of 4 hours or something like that?
It's not much writing at all. It's mostly thinking about it and taking notes. That's about it so far.
Do you
But
give
I have
yourself a
pretty,
deadline? I'm sure the people that are listening right now and watching want to know when your next novel's coming out. So what would you say to them?
I'd say give it a couple of years. Uh, but I've done a lot of the hard work just getting through the first draft, you know,
Can you drop any hints about it?
about what it's about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's about the main character right now is a cab driver in Portland.
Right.
There's a taxi war going on.
Aha.
Yeah, there's a love story uh, that may not work out, and I guess that's about all I can really say at the moment.
That's pretty good. That's a good teaser, as they say in television. Well, Jim, it has been such a pleasure to have you with us. I mean, really, really, congratulations on the novel, a beautiful novel. And I know that everybody here tonight is thrilled. I want to thank you, our sponsors, and all the book clubs that took part in this and made it possible for people. I just have a note here from Corey. People, many comments just saying, listening from Unity. Thank you for this great program. Dorothy, very interesting, listening in Washington, South Portland. So to all of you who joined us tonight, thank you so much. And thank you, Jim Nichols, for joining us for the All Books Considered Book Club. Our June and July book club selection is The Exiles by Christina Baker Klein. It is a great read. Cindy Hahn will host that meeting. Good night, everybody.